by Bernardo that the number of people now having to resort to food banks has doubled in just a year, and we now have 1 in 10 of our population having to resort to food banks, and 29% of people surveyed saying that they were having to cut back on food and meals for their children and families. And this is really just a shocking indication in one of the richest countries of the world how huge proportions of our society are being driven into poverty because of the failure of the government to address the cost of living crisis. And of course this comes on top of the Kantar figures showing that food inflation has gone up by an incredible 16% in just 12 weeks running up to the middle of January. So one of the calls we are going to be making is to say there needs to be now an emergency budget by the government to address the absolutely shocking level of poverty that people are suffering and the failure of the government to address the cost of living crisis that people are facing. So families just on food alone are looking at increased costs of about €1,100 a year, and you can add to that shocking increases in energy costs and shocking increases in rents and accommodation. So ordinary working people have seen their incomes cut by thousands of euro, and as we said at the time of the budget, that, you know, setting aside one-off payments which have all now disappeared, huge sections of our population are now very considerably poorer, and many being driven into actual poverty as a result of the failure of the government to address the cost of living crisis. So our call is that there has to be an emergency budget to increase basic social welfare and pension rates and income levels to at least keep pace with inflation, and the introduction of price controls on basic goods and services, as the government has the power to do under the Consumer Protection Act. And of course there is an important contrast that while the number of people who are now having to rely on food banks has doubled, we had a report a few weeks ago showing that the number of people with wealth in excess of €4.5 million a year has also doubled. So there's a very clear contrast. While huge numbers of our population are actually being driven into food poverty, don't have enough money to feed their children and feed their families, we've had an enormous increase in the number of multi-millionaires in this country. That has to stop, and we want an emergency budget and price controls introduced to address the cost of living crisis. I just wanted to mention one thing. It's not on the Dáil agenda this week, but I just want to signal that we think it is an important thing to continue to pressure the government on. The survivors of mother and babies' homes are absolutely furious that the government have excluded more than 20,000 people from redress under the mother and baby home scheme on the arbitrary basis that they didn't spend up to 6 months in mother and babies' homes. That is an absolutely shocking failure to acknowledge the suffering of people who are forcibly separated, mothers who are forcibly separated from the children, or children who are forcibly separated from their mothers, and the survivors have not given up. That bill is coming back into the Dáil. We don't quite know when, and we are calling on Minister O'Gorman to step back from this outrageous failure to acknowledge the true suffering of those who went through the mother and baby homes, and to amend that legislation, to pull back, because it is an absolute insult to those who suffered abuse and mistreatment at the hands of church and state.
Just when you call for an emergency budget, Richard, what would you be calling? You said welfare and pension payments go up. What would you put them up by?
Well,
what do you want price caps on?
Yeah, well, the Consumer Price Act, first of all, gives the government the power to control the prices of basic goods and services in an emergency. We have made that point repeatedly, and we should have a basket of goods, which are basic goods and services, controlled in their price to ensure that they are safe. In terms of social welfare rates and pension rates, we said in the budget that in its absolute minimum, social welfare and pension rights should be above the in danger of poverty level, which was estimated at the time of the budget to be about €289. We propose that basic social welfare and pension rights should go to €300 as an absolute minimum to keep people out of poverty and to a week, yeah.
That's a lot of money.
Well, the money that people are getting at the moment is not enough to feed their families. Now, how much more serious do you want it? People are saying they're cutting back on energy bills, they're cutting back on meals for their children and family. We think it is entirely reasonable to bring basic social welfare and pension rates up to a level that ensures people don't live in poverty. How could that not be a reasonable demand in one of the richest and wealthiest countries in the world?
How much would that cost the state?
It would. I don't have the figures right in front of me, but they're in our budget submission. But you would probably be talking about a couple of billion euro, I would imagine, to bring it up. But I'd have to refer to our budget submission. But if you're looking for the figures, you can get it there.
Richard, just to get clarity on the grocery price cap, it kind of sounds a bit like the Sinn Féin energy price cap. Is that the way it would work? That you set a limit on the price of whatever it was, milk and eggs, and then the state would come in and breach the gap?
Yes, I think if necessary. Now, I mean, we should also comment on the profiteering, though. I mean, the first thing that should be addressed is the level of profiteering. We know of enormous profits being made by, for example, energy companies, and I think almost certainly many of the big retail chains have also seen very significant increases in profit. So we need to address profiteering, but if necessary, basic goods and services should be subsidised in order to make them affordable. We cannot have a situation where people are relying on food banks or cutting back on food for their children. So the government have to introduce caps to make sure that basic goods and services are affordable, and they have the powers to do it under the Consumer Protection Act.
Are food banks not a better option insofar as they target those who actually are most vulnerable? Whereas if you put a price cap on your fruit and veg, everybody would benefit from that, even people who are not struggling with the cost of it.
No, I think it is absolutely humiliating for people to be forced to have to resort to food banks. And the idea that the income that the state provides to pensioners, to people with disabilities, to some of the most vulnerable people in our society is below the level that is sufficient for them to feed their families is not acceptable. Poverty is not acceptable in what is one of the wealthiest countries in the world, where we've seen very significant economic growth, where we've seen corporate profits go through the roof, and yet we have huge cohorts of our population are required to resort to food banks. It's utterly, utterly unacceptable.
Are you calling for an increase in the national minimum wage as well?
Yes, we have long called for it. We believe there should be an increase to a living wage of at least €15 an hour. I mean, the net fact for workers is that they have lost thousands of euros of income because pay increases are a fraction of what the increases in the cost of living are, whether it's food prices, energy prices, or the cost of accommodation. So as an absolute minimum, wages and social welfare and pension rates need to be increased to match the level of inflation.
So just on the issue of the cost of living supports, cost of living supports run to the end of the month, and the position of the government is that they're looking at the situation, they're going to keep some in place and others may not be kept in place. And we want to make it very clear that we are calling for this emergency budget, but we are also issuing a warning to this government. Hands off the cost of living supports. There must be no cuts, because the cost of living crisis is still very, very real for working people and their families and people on social welfare. We have the Barnardo's report, which is saying that the numbers who need to access food banks have gone from 1 in 25 less than a year ago to 1 in 10 now. We have the Kantar report, which says that the cost of grocery shopping this year will increase by nearly €1,200, a real punch in the gut to hard-pressed families. And also, let's remember, we have the government and the state with a budget exchequer surplus of €5 billion. So we are issuing the call for an emergency budget, and we are issuing a warning to the government: hands off the cost of living supports for households. Any attempt to cut them, we will oppose them, and there will be real opposition and resistance to cuts. Working people and their families need those measures to stay in place. The only other point I'll make briefly is just to say that I am taking leaders' questions today, and I will be questioning, I presume it's the Taoiseach who's taken it today, on the issue of the refugee crisis, the rise of racism and the far right, but also how the government have played into their hands with many of the measures that they have introduced, including their shocking handling of the housing crisis. But more about that later on.
Okay, then, in relation to the nursing home charges and the withholding of disability payments, I want to, on behalf of People Before Profit, thank the Attorney General today for his findings, because he has confirmed in legalese what we have already suspected for a long time, and that is that the state is here to look after you. As long as you're not poor, as long as you're not old and sick, as long as you're not disabled, they will look after you, absolutely, if you're rich, if you're a bondholder, if you're a banker. And that's what the Attorney General has done with this declaration. He has confirmed what ordinary people and ourselves have known for a long, long time. And to be honest, I can't wait to see the election manifestos of Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael and the Greens, and how they're going to explain this to the people. Vote for us because we don't look after our most vulnerable citizens. We look after the strongest, and we look after the state's interests before anything else. So that's why I want to thank the Attorney General. The honesty is astounding, but it's also disgraceful that we have in this state a David and Goliath situation where the most vulnerable, the weakest, those with intellectual and physical disabilities, those who are sick and old, are put on par in terms of, now, take us on. We are the state with all the legal expertise in the world. It's an absolute disgrace, and this government should hang their head in shame for this not just legal but political decision of the Attorney General, or this statement that he has made. It's rare that we get to hear or see what the Attorney General thinks and advises, but this actually says a lot about what's going on in this country. So that's really it.
Yeah, I want to address the issue of the anti-refugee protests. I've made a point over the last number of days to be out and about in Dublin Southwest, talking to ordinary people to try and, gauge people's attitudes. And it's just, the world out there is a very different place from social media. The vast majority of people want absolutely nothing to do with protests outside the homes, temporary, inadequate homes of people who are fleeing from war and persecution, who are suffering from trauma. Really, public attitudes are very strongly against those protests. Even if some people may have a question mark over this or that or whatever, people can understand that that sort of thing is very bad, it's scapegoating, it's discriminatory against people who are some of the most persecuted and oppressed people in this country. And I do think that the tide is beginning to turn on this issue, whereby the majority of people who, are appalled at the hatred and the division that is being peddled by elements of the far right, are beginning to see that it isn't good enough just to have that attitude themselves, but that we need to come out together and demonstrate that, to show that the majority of people in this country are welcoming towards those who are fleeing war and persecution, who understand that refugees, asylum seekers are not to blame for the housing crisis, for the health crisis, for the other crises we have in this country, and understand that we're much stronger if we stand united against those who are actually benefiting from those crises, be they the corporate landlords, the big private developers, or the private health companies. And I think you saw the beginning of that on Saturday, with over 500 people rallying at very short notice on O'Connell Street in opposition to racism, standing in solidarity with refugees, organised by Lekela and Unite Against Racism. And that is just the first step. I think we will see thousands of people on the streets Saturday week, Saturday the 18th of February. A very broad coalition under the banner of Ireland for All has come together, involving trade unions, community groups, football groups, progressive political parties, anti-racist groups, huge numbers of groups coming together to say that Ireland is for all. There are enough resources in this country to have homes for all, to have a decent health service for all, to have jobs for all. And this is not a protest in any sense in support of government policy. It's against government policy. But it's saying, do not blame refugees, do not blame asylum seekers for the crises that ordinary people face. Instead, unite together against those who are benefiting from those crises. So there's a press event on Friday at 11 in Buswells, where a whole number of speakers will be coming together to launch that solidarity protest. But I'm very confident that thousands will be on the street, and that the opinions of the majority in this country will be demonstrated on the street. I would also echo the point that Mick Barry made in terms of the government's response to all of that is quite disgraceful. It will just have the effect of emboldening the far right elements. The way that they are saying that if you're not from Ukraine and you're a man, you can go onto the streets, you can get a Dunn's voucher, you can get €5 phone credit. It's a scandal how people are being treated in this country, particularly when we have 50,000 homes that have been vacant for 6 years or more.
Brí, can I ask you to just comment on the language and the tone in the AG's report? Do you have any
Well, I think it's quite...
insight of that?
Yeah, well, I'm not a legal expert by a long shot, but I think it's quite political, and it does indicate that there's no empathy really there for the past sins of the government, even though what's remarkable about it is we've been through 10 years of apologies, of redress schemes, of, public sort of mea culpa from the government, whether it's over the Magdalen laundries or the traveller movement or, the latest, the mother and baby homes. And yet when it comes to another cohort of extremely vulnerable people, they're giving them two fingers, literally. And that's what I think of the tone of what the Attorney General has said. And it backs them up politically, not just legally, which is quite extraordinary and begs a lot of questions about how this state is structured and how it's run. And I think it's this scandal, I think, has a long way to go yet. It's not over.